This is Congress for the week of April 5th through 9th. This is the second module. I hope I can get through this without pushing the stop button accidentally. I'm continuing giving our discussion of chapters 6 and 7 of Davidson and Olzik, etc. And then finish with Malbin's discussion of the change in the nature of congressional staff and the role of congressional staff. So we're picking up on the notes that I passed out, and D on the first page. And this is a kind of a transitional subject between Chapter 6, which is about parties and leadership, and Chapter 7, which is on committees. Generally speaking, the party structure in Congress and the structure of leadership is the primary centralizing force in Congress and organizing force. You have to remember that Congress is a plural body, just as we go back to our initial discussions about Locke, that a legislative body should probably be composed of many members from all over the country, the representative issue combined with the legislative issue. But that means, of course, like all plural bodies, there's a natural tendency towards decentralization or kind of a centrifugal tendencies. And therefore, the issue with a plural body is always how to get its members to act together, of course, to deliberate and to discuss and to vote, but also those are the actions of a legislative body. But of course, don't forget Congress is also a bicameral body. And as you're going to see when we turn to committees, there are good reasons why the standing committee system developed in Congress, and we'll on the next page we'll go through the kind of history as it's kind of related and summarized in Chapter 7. But obviously, one of the effects of a standing committee system, and you'll see, I'll reiterate this a few times, that means that the main legislative activity of Congress occurs, of course, the final stage in legislative activity is voting on the floor, obviously. But the most of Congress's legislative activity, of course, occurs in committees, and that means that the main effect of the committee system is to further decentralize Congress, because obviously the 16 standing committees or so in the Senate and the 20 to 21 standing committees in the House, obviously they divide the power and concentration of Congress up into smaller bodies. So even though the party system, the party leadership system, and the committee system work together and blend, we partially pointed that out in terms of the functions of the parties, in terms of appointing committees and committee chairs, etc. Nevertheless, these they do somewhat possess opposite tendencies. And you'll see Davidson and Olzik talk about this in terms of the Chapter 8 and 9 rules and decision making, and to some degree in the chapter on parties and committees too. But we'll explore this differences between the houses more when we turn to the Baker book. And there's a kind of a formula of generalization here. The stronger that leadership, especially in the House in the discussion in Chapter 6 of the Speaker, and the stronger parties, the stronger the institution, and it is easier for the institution to act. The weaker the leadership in parties, and we'll see that there have been different stages both in terms of party leadership and organization, and also committee organization, then the stronger the members are, and often the weaker and difficult it is for the institution to act. And in the 1970s and 80s, Congress probably went through its most decentralized period, probably post-Watergate, and we saw that with the Robinson article and certain aspects of Davidson and Olzik previously, that Watergate was a kind of a turning point, watershed in American politics, because it meant not only a different attitude towards the institutions of government by the press, but Congress went through several reform stages, and part of the reaction against the dominance of strong party leadership in the 60s and 70s, 50s, 60s, and 70s was a tendency to decentralize, to accentuate the power of committees and committee chairs and even subcommittees. And almost everybody by the end of the 1970s and 80s thought that had probably gone to an extreme. And there were several reforms set in motion, discussed in these chapters, by the way, that when the Republicans took power in 1994, 2 years into President Clinton's administration, when Newt Gingrich became the Speaker, and then the Contract with America, which is discussed in the Davidson and Olzik, there were several reforms, both of the Speaker's authority, but also of the committee system, etc., that somewhat strengthened the role of parties and the Speaker. And we'll see when we go through the different stages and phases of that. One thing about the way that Congress works internally, by the way, and that has to be remarked because it's not intrinsic either in the constitutional setup of Congress. It's not even implicit necessarily in the committee or the party system, and that is the effect of seniority. Now, and that is to say, the general way that you get to leadership positions in both chambers is by being there longer. And of course, you know that once incumbency rose in the House, especially, then that really means the longer you're there, the more leadership positions you would turn to. And generally speaking, when you look at those two charts on page 141 and 153, the way that you move up the ladder towards leadership in the House and the Senate is through seniority. Now, just a comment about why seniority became so critical in the internal operation of Congress and how it's been modified to some degree. After the revolt against Speaker Cannon in 1910 and the Speaker's power, because that was probably the peak of the Speaker's authority, as Chapter 6 relates it, in the entire history of the House, the power kind of devolved to the committee chairs, and the way that you got elevated to committee chairs and party leadership again was seniority. Seniority, if you think about it, is a way of kind of suppressing party conflict within party organizations, because it's a way of assigning leadership that people don't have to run for office, they don't have to compete with each other. Seniority simply assigns these positions. Now, there are obviously downsides to this. I mean, obviously, just because you're there longer doesn't mean you're good at what you do. It just means you're there longer. And since both House and Senate are the power base for each member is located actually in their individual districts. After all, it's their districts and their states who elect the members. It's not like a parliament where the party, where candidates run proportionately under a party label. So strictly speaking, if you are reelected by your district outside the Congress, that means then that you'll accrue positions of leadership. Now, in the 1970s, there was something of a revolt against this because, as Davidson and Olzik point out, there is a certain sense in which, especially in the Democratic Party, that tended to favor Southern Democrats who were either, up until the 1960s, actually segregationist. I mean, the Democratic Party up through the New Deal through the 1960s was really a coalition of two quite different parties. The emergent, progressive, liberal, nationally oriented New Deal Party, kind of with its origins in the progressive movement and Woodrow Wilson and then FDR, of course. But then don't forget the Democratic Party, the South was a one-party system because, of course, the Republican Party was hated because it was the party of Lincoln and the Union. And as a result, many of the Southern representatives and senators accrued remarkable power in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, especially Wilbur Mills, because they were reelected so frequently that they were often the most powerful members within the Democratic Party. Now, after segregation became a dead issue with the civil rights legislation and the civil rights movement, then the Southern Democratic Party went through a realignment, and many, by the way, the Republican Party, which was non-competitive prior to the 60s and 70s, became a competitive. In fact, there was a realignment in the South where the Republican Party actually became the majority party because, again, all these conservative Democrats, once segregationists, but conservative, in terms of the American ideological spectrum, kind of gravitated towards the Southern Republican Party, and that's the way it's kind of remained. It's probably changing. I mean, and the election in Georgia this last year may suggest that Georgia, which was a red state, is now kind of becoming purplish or bluish, as has Virginia to some degree. But to go back to the question of seniority, so in the 1970s, the parties, the Democratic Party especially, by the way, wanted to somewhat curb the power of these senior Southern Democrats, and so there was kind of a revolt against seniority. But seniority is still the primary way that you move up within each party towards positions of leadership, and that means also committee leaderships. So in both houses, in both chambers, for instance, committee chairmen tend to be the most senior member, either the ranking member of the minority or the chair of the majority party tend to be the senior members on that committee and within the party. The same with the majority leaders and minority leaders in both House and Senate and so forth. So unless, by the way, the party decides, again, I would say that in today's Congress there's a blend of the principle of seniority and party control. But party seniority is still pretty much the way that you move up in leadership and power, although it can be modified and has been modified more of a party in the last couple of decades. So on the top of the second page of the notes, just to repeat what I said, we'll see that the blend of influence in the party system and committee system is whereas parties and leadership are the primary concentrating and centralizing function, the committee system tends to be the major decentralizing and framing structure. So what are the basic functions of the committee system? First of all, let's actually start with the second thing that I mentioned at the top of page 8. The main reason, and as we see when we go through the historical development of the committee system, the main reason that standing committees developed was to concentrate expertise and also division of labor and workload. You'll understand more when I actually go through the history in the middle of that page of the different shifts, and we'll see what existed before the standing committee system and why it developed. But the committees, since they are the bulk of where legislative activity takes place, they also are where members tend to exercise their most influence and spend most of their time within Congress, with the internal dimensions of the legislative functions of Congress. And so, to some degree, the way that parties then maintain their control, and this goes back to something I said in the last module, the way that parties maintain their control with the decentralization of the power structure within the committees is each committee becomes a little reflection of the proportion of the party within the larger chamber. So whoever has the majority, and this is why who has the majority in each chamber becomes so critical. It's not just who has the most votes on any bill. Whoever controls the chamber controls who's on the committees, although again, generally speaking, let's back up. The proportion of the membership within the larger house becomes the basis of assigning the proportion of members within a committee. So as I said in a minute ago, generally speaking, the most senior member on that committee becomes the chair of the committee, although, again, the parties have been exercising more influence on those decisions and can depose a disobedient or non-cooperative chair of a committee if that chair starts to go against the instincts of the party within that chamber. Since the committee is where most of Congress's activity takes place, of course, the main thing that it contributes is a concentration of influence for individual members. The division of labor and expertise that I mentioned, and note, by the way, when we come to questions such as term limits, I'll just plant this question in your head when we come back to this at the end of the course. Many people think that term limits are a good thing until they think, by the way, that then diminishes the amount of expertise, because obviously in the House, for instance, where members only serve on one committee, whereas in the Senate members serve on 2 to 3 committees and sometimes more subcommittees. So that's a big difference, of course, and the reason for that is just because of the size of the membership. This is one of those aspects, and we'll see this when we come to the Baker book, which compares both chambers. Obviously, in terms of the maintenance of the constitutional design and intention of the framers, things like the size of the institution, the fact that the House has been and still is over 4 times larger than the Senate, that actually explains a good portion of the differences between the House and the Senate. And the Senate is a smaller body, and you have, even though there are 21 standing committees in the House and 16 or so in the Senate, basically, with the exception of the 4 extra ones in the House, they obviously cover the same subject materials, and Davidson and Olzik in Chapter 7 do a nice comparison of the two-chamber committee system. Obviously, and that partially corresponds with the executive branches. Obviously, there's an agricultural committee in both the House and the Senate, and there's a Department of Agriculture. There's Armed Services Committee, and just as there is a Department of Defense. So if you have fewer numbers of members, then you have to serve on more than one committee, and that's exactly what happens in the Senate. Whereas in the House, people only serve on one committee, but that means with more incumbency, with more seniority, and the concentration of expertise, oftentimes, interestingly enough, the most important experts in particular policy areas are long-standing members in the House. Now, again, when it comes to term limits, if there were term limits, say, limiting members of the House to a couple of terms, then, which would obviously increase the amount of turnover in the House and may, in fact, interestingly enough, make the House more representative, even in the larger Madisonian sense. But you have to see that would then also diminish the amount of pooled expertise in the House, which would then relatively weaken the House and the Senate, for that matter, vis-a-vis the executive branch. So again, this goes back to the initial reflections about institutions and changing them and reforming them. You always have to be on the lookout for unintended consequences, which means you have to see the way these institutions really work before you go modifying one thing. Because if you modify one thing, you'll likely affect another aspect of the institution's functioning that you hadn't thought about. So, and of course, the other thing that the committee system does is it answers the goals of individual members. And Fenno, in both Homestyle and Davidson and Olzik, and you'll see, by the way, that both in Chapter 7 and in subsequent 8 and 9, to some degree, members have different interests as legislators. Some are more interested in re-election. And Fenno's book, The Challenge of Congressional Representation, in the particular members of the House that he focused on, again, some were more interested in legislation, were activists, more committed to policy and issue activism, and some were more interested in representing the district in re-election. And to some degree, the committee assignments that members ask for or request, and people request them, and that's, by the way, you're going to see that's one of the things that keeps the power of the leadership and of the party organization strong, is to some degree, if you stray too far from the leadership's requests or the party positions on many things, that means that you will either be taken off the committee or not be assigned the committee that you want. And so there are corresponding checks and balances. In terms of Chapter 7, just pay attention to, for instance, the 4 basic kinds of committees. I'm not going to discuss those and elaborate because the discussion of the text is so clear. The standing committees are the primary permanent committees, and that's where the bulk of legislation is done. And oversight of the executive branch, too, by the way. There are special committees or select committees which come into being for particular purposes and are often temporary. Although oftentimes what was one time a temporary or select committee can grow into a permanent committee. But there have been some very important select committees, like, for instance, the Senate Select Committee on Watergate, chaired by Sam Ervin in 1973, was one of the major, probably one of the major forces that brought down President Nixon. In 2013 and 14, the House Special Committee on Benghazi had a marathon. Some of you may remember this. Hearing session with Hillary Clinton, I think a 13-hour one. And so that highlighted the attack on the American embassy under the Obama administration in Benghazi. And then the other 2 kinds of committees are joint committees. The joint committees, by the way, where there are they straddle both House and Senate, tend not to be major committees. They have to do with administration of the District of Columbia. There's a joint committee on taxation, on the economy. And the joint committees, generally speaking, are not sought after. They're not areas of major influence. They are mostly for information and research, and they don't report out legislation. Now, a conference committee is a temporary joint committee that only comes into being if there are differences in a bill passed by both the House and the Senate that need to be reconciled. And we'll come back to that question of the way that conference committees work, because Baker has a nice discussion of those. So what are the major activities of the committees? Legislation, of course. And you'll see that that the main activity of legislation is what's called the markup sessions. And that is the main again, legislative function and activity of the committees. When we talk about changes in the rules, for instance, and other reforms in Congress, one big change in the 1970s was, prior to the 1970s, the default setting for all committee markup sessions. And what a markup session is where the actual language of legislation is drafted and worked out. Just to note, when we come back to this with the Malbin article, much of that is now done by staff, both on the committee and personal legislative staff. But markups are the heart of the legislative process. One of the major reforms in the 1970s was the opening up of that through sunshine legislation to make more processes and aspects of Congress open to the public. For instance, that's where the televisation of the House came in 1977, and subsequently later in the mid-'80s with the Senate. And the major change in terms of how legislation is done that probably had a profound effect on the way Congress works as an institution is again, the default setting prior to the 1970s was that the markup sessions were closed. And therefore that meant there was a certain lack of public scrutiny and therefore lack of public pressure too. And then the reforms of the 1970s were to open that up, and that seems like a great idea. Oh boy, the public can scrutinize what's going on in Congress. Except I can assure you, the public, and even with C-SPAN, only about 6% of the American people if anybody watches any of the 3 C-SPAN networks, and to some degree, the major beneficiaries of the opening up of markup sessions has been, of course, lobbyists and special interest groups. More about that towards the end of the semester. The other two primary activities of the standing committees are hearings, and hearings are the ostensible justification. And by the way, the Congress has punitive ability to subpoena people for hearings. The court has upheld this, the Supreme Court, and to some degree, the major justification for hearings, especially public hearings, is a research for the information for legislation. But actually, hearings are often public events. Like, for instance, the Benghazi hearing was probably more about putting heat on the Obama administration than about actually research into the actual events. So, but hearings are an important part, and often committees will often issue both with minority and majority reports. And then reports again are where committees will issue, and that the reports that committees issue can often have an important effect on subsequent legislation and negotiation on the floor. And we'll come back to this when we talk about cues and how people who are not on a committee, because obviously one of the effects of the standing committee system, as we'll see, is the core legislative activity then moved to committees, which meant basically that the core action of both the House and the Senate moved from the floor, because in the first decade, the floor action, which meant discussion, debating, and voting, was where the thrust of congressional activity took place. But once the committee system arose in 1816 with the first standing committee, more about that in a minute, then obviously the primary activity of Congress as a legislative body shifted into the committees, and so that means that members of Congress know their committee material very well. They're specialists and expertise in that. But when it comes to the rest of the legislation that they vote on, they are generalists, and often know not much more about other pending legislation that's not on their committee jurisdiction than, say, journalists or even citizens do. And so the question is, unless every member of Congress, of the House and Senate, read every bill that they vote on, how do they know how to vote if it's from a subject that's not from their committee? And you'll see that's where some of the decision making discussed in Chapter 9 comes in, especially the idea of cues, which we'll come back to. So if you're looking in the middle of the second page of the notes, let me just quickly go through the history of the party committee system. So once the Congress started working in 1789, the first Congress on March 4th, 1789, the first Congress met. Up into the 1820s, Congress was essentially an institution of loose partisanship, where there were temporary caucuses based upon support or opposition for bills, and there was no permanent committee structure. The way that legislation would be introduced and processed would be somebody would stand up and introduce a bill on the floor, discuss it, and there would often be prior discussion. Now, if an issue of legislation was complex, then an ad hoc means for this purpose, a special committee would be created that would then work on the bill and everything and then report back to the floor, and then it would be debated and passed or not passed. Now, by 1816, and so this would be the second stage in this series of stages, and again, this kind of combines the material both in Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. Once the parties began to form and began to dominate American politics, they obviously became the organizational force within Congress, with patronage and transformation of the Speaker into a party office. And then, again, the first standing committee was created in the House in 1816, the Appropriations Committee, because the financial legislation became so complex, and then eventually there was a Ways and Means, a tax-raising revenue committee, and then a spending committee, and then the Finance Committee, and the Senate was also created. And so by the time of the Civil War, this system was in place. And as I mentioned earlier, the main effect on the way Congress does legislation was the thrust of congressional legislative activity shifted from the floor to the committees. Now, the floor is still critical because that's where final passage of legislation is. And oftentimes that's where most of the public focus is on and debating and that kind of stuff. But as you're going to see, House debate, chamber debate, very rarely changes positions on legislation for reasons we'll see later on. So from the Civil War to the 1890s, this was there was a revolt against committee leadership, party leadership, and it was the rise of the committee chairman. And even Woodrow Wilson was a political scientist before he became president of Princeton, governor of New Jersey, and then president, was a political scientist. And his first book, Congressional Government, in 1888, I believe, was about how powerful the committees were, and essentially Congress consisted of little oligarchies where committee chairmen essentially held the legislative pulse of the country. That began to change from the 1890s to 1910, and Davidson and Oleszek chronicle that with the rise of the most powerful speaker in U.S. history, and that was Speaker Joe Cannon. And so from the 1890s to 1910, the Speaker, for instance, appointed members to committee, appointed chairmanships, chaired the Rules Committee in the House that structures debate. We're going to see more about that in Chapter 8 and 9. And until you could say it was pushed to its limit, and Speaker Joe Cannon, by the way, he has one of my favorite political quotes, which I'll just go ahead and say. Cannon is famous for saying that a statesman is a politician who's been dead for a while. There, kind of a cynical view of statesmanship. But anyway, in 1910, rebellious Republicans voted with Democrats because the Republicans were the majority party in the House and Senate, really up into the 1930s. And to strip the Speaker of much of his powers. And then from about 1910 to 1970, the committee fiefdom was like a return to the strong decentralized committee system with powerful committee chairs and the rise of seniority, as I mentioned earlier. And then from the 1970s and 1990s, there was the subcommittee system where power became even more, as I mentioned, there was a kind of a post-Watergate reaction against, and a post-civil rights era reaction against these Southern Democrats that had accrued a lot of seniority power. And power is even more decentralized and fragmented, where subcommittees became actually where most of the activity was. Now, everybody admits that this was probably the time during Congress's history when legislation was most difficult, because when things are so decentralized and speaker and the leadership has relatively little authority over the party and therefore the business of each chamber, obviously it's very hard to get productive legislation done. And so today, and this is really the system that we have since, as I already mentioned, and since 1994, when the Republicans, for the first time since 1953, became the majority party in both chambers of Congress, because really the Democrats had been the majority party in the country, and certainly the governing majority, with a short exception in 1980 when the Republicans took the Senate, but then the Democrats won it back in 1984. But then in 1994, again, Newt Gingrich led a kind of a nationalized many of the issues of politics. Interestingly enough, which probably brought the Republicans to power, was a reaction against Bill Clinton's proposed reform of the healthcare system, under which he had, by the way, designated to Hillary Clinton, the First Lady, and chaired that. And there was such a strong reaction against that, both Democrats and Republicans, that's probably what brought the Republicans to power. But part of that coming to power was the Contract with America, which was partially an internal reform of Congress, especially the House, which somewhat accentuated the power of the Speaker. And so from 1994 to the present, we have basically kind of a new Speaker, stronger party system, with some modifications in Davidson and Olzik pointing out that essentially that that's the present system. Look at Nancy Pelosi, for instance, a pretty powerful speaker. But she would not have been a powerful speaker had not Newt Gingrich been a powerful speaker in the 1990s, etc. So that's kind of where we are today. And we'll see in Chapter 8 and 9, we'll talk about rules and decision-making. We'll come back to the questions about why we have the committees that we do and why they have the powers that they have and how do they structure behavior and goals. More about that in the next couple of chapters. But a couple of things to summarize the combination of the party and committee system. And I make 6 core points just to walk through them on the notes. Again, since the rise of the system, most of Congress's activities are out of sight, beyond public scrutiny. And floor debate and floor action, aside from final voting and that kind of stuff, has a kind of if you watch C-SPAN, nobody tends to be impressed by a debate in the House and Senate. And you'll see why when we turn to Chapter 8 with the rules, with that structured debate. The House, for instance, is an extremely structured and hierarchical and much more majority-controlled and party-controlled and leadership-controlled body than the Senate is. Nobody thinks that great orators are born and raised or cultivated in the House, let alone the Senate. Now, if you watch C-SPAN, they sometimes have parliamentary debate from like Parliament in England, which is often much more stirring and interesting, and it's probably true that British statesmen stateswomen are more developed speakers, because Parliament literally means a talking body. So the first main point is that really committees is where the legislative business of Congress takes place. And most membership goals, the second point, are fulfilled in committee. When you get elected, like for instance, obviously, the members from Iowa and Illinois are much more interested in agricultural issues and that kind of stuff. But it depends. I mean, some members are more interested in foreign affairs. Some are more interested in different parts of the world, in defense, etc., climate, those kinds of issues, banking. And third, most members of Congress don't know the content of bills. That's because, again, one of the byproducts, one of the consequences of specialization and serving in committee is you know the material in the committee that you serve on, especially in the House, where you serve for the same committee for many years, and you concentrate on one committee. Now, again, this raises some interesting questions about the nature of congressional deliberation and decision-making, and that leads to the fourth point, and you'll see that Chapter 9 develops this more fully, that most members depend upon cues, and the primary cue, there are other cues, and we'll talk about what a cue is. Obviously, a cue is a kind of a substitute for immediate knowledge, expertise, and deliberation. So if you'll see that in the same way that party forms for members of the citizen body, a kind of a cue that directs their decision making, it's also that party, but other things also direct members of Congress voting on things. And you'll see this is complicated by Malbin's point in just a minute. And so what a cue is, again, is a substitute for direct knowledge of the content of a bill and decision. Now, is that good or bad? We'll come back to that question. The fifth point is that reform, and I already mentioned this briefly earlier, has opened up the committee process, the markup session especially. But for whom? The idea was to benefit the public by opening up the committee. But again, to expect the American people to pay strident attention to the internal, as for reasons that, by the way, if you go back to the Robinson article, Congress as a whole institution tends to be messily covered and adversely covered by the national media. And so even with the internal media of C-SPAN, for instance, committee hearings by and large go unscrutinized, and probably the part of our political system that really benefited from the opening up of committees, again, were or lobbies and organized interest. More about that later. And the second thing, and this will be tied to one of our authors that will come back later on in the end of the course, hearings, which is one of the three major activities of the committees, hearings, reports, and markups, have become mostly advocacy for policy activists. Now, is that good or bad? Again, you'll see it all depends on the context, and we'll come back to that, especially in the Payne book, The Culture of Spending. So rather than have a third module, I'm just going to go ahead and talk about the last part of this material for April 5th to 9th, and that is Malbin's article on staff. First of all, again, remember, this article was written, Michael Malbin's a major scholar of Congress. He's still publishing, and he did a fuller version of this article, which he published as Unelected Representatives. And what you'll find in this article is kind of an elaboration of the parts on staff in Chapter 5 of the Davidson and Oleszek, is that, is one, the explosion of staff. At its peak, the number of members of the staff, and that involves, by the way, both personal staff, both legislative and congressional service staff, and since about the 1980s through today, basically every member of the House, and leadership has more, of course, and to some degree committee chairs have more. The staff of committees tends to become extensions of the committee chair staff, but more about that in a bit. So every member of the Senate roughly has between 16 and 20 staff members, which are both for legislative purposes. That's what we're going to talk more about at the end of the Malbin piece, about the consequences of this explosion in staff, and the expansion of the role of staff. That's the most interesting thing about Malbin's article, as we'll see in a second, and the profound and perhaps disturbing question that it raises. But more about that. You should know, so Malbin's article details the kinds of staff, and there are three kinds of staff. Personal staff, that I was just discussing that, and again, members of the House between 11 and 15, Senate between 16 and 20, and they divide them between constituency service work, or the staff that helps members of Congress work with the constituencies, versus the legislative staff. Then there's the committee staff, and Malbin chronicles how the committee staff developed, and of course, by the way, originally the staff was just, we're talking about a secretary. I think in the 1850s and 60s, members of the Senate got a secretary. Now, of course, as Malbin details, by the 1970s and 80s and 90s, the total number of staff in Congress had reached 30 to 40,000. Now it's been somewhat reduced, and the number of staff, and I gave some contemporary websites. You can look at the notes if you're interested in pursuing this. It's probably down to between 20 and 30,000. But that means, in other words, Congress as an institution isn't just the 5 representatives in the House and the 100 members of the Senate. There's this whole vast other structure of institution. And the committee staff, by the way, there was a time when they were viewed as nonpartisan, but essentially they become partisan and extensions of them, the different parties and members on the committee. And this also raises the critical issue of the function of staff, as you'll see. And then the other kind of staff are the staff agencies. Now, the oldest one is the Congressional Research Service, which was an expansion of the Library of Congress. And the Library of Congress began in the year 1800s when Thomas Jefferson, who had the largest personal library at Monticello in the United States, but it was constantly in debt and couldn't handle his money, he sold his library to the Library of Congress. That became the Library of Congress. And, of course, the Library of Congress today is the largest collection on earth and has more published volumes and publications than any other collection or library, again, on the entire planet. The Congressional Research Service has grown in importance because technically any member can submit a request for information, and of course what the members of the Congressional Research work on, depending upon what's happening in the country. You can imagine that when the Iranian Revolution occurred in 1977, that the request for information about Iran. So basically, that's what the Congressional Research Service does. It responds to requests for information by members of Congress and sometimes committees too. The second institution, I should say the second oldest institution, is the General Accounting Office, which was created in 1921 with the Budget Act of 1921, and its primary aim is to kind of be an accounting and budgeting supervisory group over the executive branch, sort of corresponding to the Office of Management and Budget, which is part of the Executive Office of the President. The third institution or staff institution is the Congressional Budget Office, which was created in 1974 by the Budget Control and Empowerment Act of 1974, which we'll come back to because that set the primary budgeting process for Congress. It was a complex piece of legislation, and the aim was to kind of strengthen congressional control of the budget, which didn't quite work out. But it did create, by the way, the critical process of the annual budget, which, by the way, also includes the procedure of reconciliation, which is the way that Congress votes on final spending and budgetary matters. And that's important. It's become important because many of the policy initiatives of the Biden administration, because of the 50-50 split in the Senate and the question of the filibuster, things can pass with a simple majority, through reconciliation, where the budget projections for the year are reconciled with the actual spending for the budget for the final budget. And in several critical times, like in Obamacare in 2009 and 2010, it was the reconciliation process because that avoids the filibuster maneuver. And with a 50-50 split, and with many of the controversial aspects of the Biden administration's legislation push, the reconciliation procedure, which was set in motion by the 74 Act, has become critical, and more about that on the chapter on rules and procedures. But the Congressional Budget Office was created to give budgetary projections for spending and everything, and the CBO has been often important in debates, like, for instance, on the question of raising the minimum wage. When this was a thrust of the new Biden administration, and the progressive wing of the Democratic Party had more or less gotten even the moderate Democrats this last couple of months to sign on to raising the national minimum wage to $15 an hour. And it was estimated that would lift a certain 900,000 people out of poverty, but that would also it would also create end about 1.5 million jobs. So the CBO and his projections, both economic projections and budgetary projections, can have an effect on, and that probably helped to kill the raising the national minimum wage to $15. The other thing that happened to kill it, by the way, was even though it was an attempt to pass through the reconciliation, therefore just 50% plus, of course, the vote of Vice President Harris, was Joe Manchin and one of, I think, Kristen Sinema said that they would not support a national minimum wage, and that kind of killed it. But the last article, and by the way, here's where the Malbin article is a little out of date. The Office of Technological Assessment was also created in the early 70s to help Congress get a sense of the thrust, the meaning of new technology, but it was disbanded several years ago, and therefore there were only 3 staff agencies. Also, the Malbin article talks a little bit about some of the leadership and group staff within Congress, too, which is interesting. Now, what's most interesting in Malbin's article is not only detailing the explosion of the number of staff, which, again, even if it's down a little bit from its peak, probably is between 20 and 30,000, something like that, is the other, so aside from the massive size and increase in staff, is the change in staff profile, of who staffers are, and the third thing is the expansion of the role of staff. And Malbin chronicles that, especially with the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and today, staffers now became primarily younger and upwardly mobile, as opposed to permanent staff members, who and more partisan. And by the way, when it comes to personal staff, and committee staff, the staff of Congress are not within the civil service system, so they can be fired and hired for political reasons and fired at will, as opposed to the civil service system, which means you can't be fired for political reasons or hired for political reasons. You have to be, it's the merit system in the executive branch. So hold on to that fact, because that points to both the serious question that Malbin raises and also his own answer to it, sort of. So aside from the change from like the permanent established individuals, career individuals, to more upwardly mobile, younger, and dependent staff, the other major thing is the expansion of the role of staff. And what Malbin found was that, especially committee staff, but also personal legislative staff, that are doing the primary writing of bills and the negotiation of bills. Now, it's true, only members of Congress can vote on bills. They have the constitutional authority to pass bills. But this is the serious question that Malbin raises, and you can see this serious question related in the book that he eventually wrote, which is based on this article, Unelected Representatives. That is to say, the thrust of Congress, remembered, going back to the Davidson and Olza book, was to combine this representational function with the deliberative and legislative function. But as bills have gotten larger, more complex, and as this number of staff and their role is expanded, what Malbin found is that, generally speaking, not only do members generally not read the text of the legislation they're voting on. Now, if it's within their committee jurisdiction, that's a little bit different. But even when it comes to negotiating the content of markup sessions and everything like that, he found that, generally speaking, there's been a massive delegation of those functions of both negotiation and deliberation and the drafting of legislation to staff members, which leads to the natural question. Does this mean that the writing of our legislation is passed from elected representatives who have delegated it to and passed it on to unelected representatives? And has that changed the nature of Congress's constitutional functioning? That's a pretty serious question, and I would recommend, if you're interested in this, to kind of pursue this in his larger study. He himself kind of moderated the thrust of this by suggesting that because congressional staff members serve at the pleasure of two aspects of this younger, more upwardly mobile staff, who are also more dependent upon members of Congress for hiring. One is, he found that members of Congress, of course, have a tendency to hire ideological and political partisans who reflect their points of view. So there is a certain sense in which, even if staff members are doing the writing of drafting of legislation, and the negotiation of the final content of legislation. Since they are not part of the civil service system, they are hired for political reasons, and then therefore Malbin found that generally speaking, staff members, both committee and personal staff, tend to be ideological and partisan extensions of their congressional masters, the representatives and the senators. And the other thing is since they can be fired at will, that creates a kind of a short leash for staff members, both committee and personal staff. So even though the serious question still remains, and you may not think that the idea that most members of Congress are voting by cues rather than direct knowledge of the legislation that they're drafting, that they are not drafting actually, that their staff are drafting and negotiating, that raises a serious question. Malbin himself sort of came eventually down on the suggestion that there's still a serious question there, but that the implications are not as grave as one might think, because again, staff members tend to be partisan and ideological extensions of their representatives and senators who hire them, and since they serve at the pleasure, they have relatively short leash, and therefore members of staff try to anticipate what their representative, their congressional masters would anticipate. So there's an interesting question, and so those are the three primary internal structures within Congress. There won't be a third module for the material for this last week because we pretty much covered this. So the material for Chapter 8 and 9 we will be discussing this week, and then as I laid out the rest of the semester, we'll follow that schedule.